Hi, everyone. About a week ago, one of my live streams was about how to construct a Paper One Part A essay. And that was very well received. People were very glad that I posted that. So, obviously, the natural progression is to post how to construct a Paper One Part B essay. But before I do that, let's roll the intro. So, as I said, this video will focus on how to construct a Paper One Part B essay, the 15-mark essay, the evaluation essay. Remember, this essay is in Paper One, and you should expect to write an essay, a Paper One Part B essay, in 45 minutes. Okay, that's the amount of time you need. What I have here are the assessment criteria. Okay, I'm going to look at the highest level, what you need to do to achieve the highest level, which is between 13 and 15 marks. You need to make sure that the specific demands of the question are understood and addressed. Obviously, if your essay doesn't address the question because you didn't understand the question, you're not going to score very high. You need to make sure that relevant theory is fully explained. This is where a lot of students struggle. They start to explain theory that isn't very relevant, or they explain relevant theory, but they explain it incorrectly or ineffectively. You need to make sure it's fully explained. You need to make sure relevant economic terms, all the key terms, are used appropriately throughout the response. So you are mentioning the relevant key terms and you're using them appropriately throughout the essay. Where appropriate, you need to make sure that relevant diagram or diagrams are included. You've drawn them and you have fully explained these diagrams. Diagrams should not just be drawn for decorative purposes. The response needs to contain evidence of effective and balanced synthesis or evaluation. You need to make sure that your evaluation is effective and that you have balanced. You have a balance between pros and cons, short-term and long-term effects. There's a balance between discussing the stakeholders gaining and the stakeholders losing. You have discussed the theory in theory, but you've also critiqued the theory in practice. There needs to be balance in your evaluation. And you need to have a relevant real world example that you have identified and you have fully developed this real world example to support the argument or the arguments that you are making. Okay, this is what a 13 out of 15 looks like. You might be thinking, wow, how do I do all of that? Well, I have a simple structure. I start by telling my students define 1 to 2 key terms. By the way, you don't need definitions, okay? They're not part of the assessment criteria. But I believe that one of the ways of signaling that you know theory is to define the main key term or the main 2 key terms mentioned in the question, okay? And then you explain relevant economic theory while giving your RWE. RWE is your real world example. So you kind of introduce your real world example while you are explaining the relevant theory. You don't have to fully develop that yet. You can fully develop it later in the evaluation. Draw and then explain any relevant diagram or diagrams. Every shift, every curve needs to be explained in the body of the essay, not just draw a diagram for decorative purposes. And then evaluate using your chosen real world example. Okay, this is where you think about long term versus short term effects. This is where you think about who gains, who are the stakeholders that gain versus who loses. This is where you think about the pros versus the cons of whatever it is you're evaluating. This is where you think about how things are in theory or the assumptions versus in practice. Remember, the real world doesn't always match or fit the theory you're trying to explain. This is your evaluation. And then you need to make sure that you link back to the question, okay, to make sure that you have addressed it. Okay, so this is kind of the structure that I suggest. Okay, here are a few paper one questions. Okay, let's have a look at the part B. Using real world examples, evaluate different approaches to managing common access resources. I've highlighted the term common access resources because that's the term that you will need to define. And then the relevant theory that you need to explain is that of market failure. Okay, so this is from the market failure unit. Okay, let's have a look at this one. Using real world examples, evaluate the effectiveness of monetary policy to achieve low unemployment. Okay, you might need to define monetary policy and then explain how demand side policies or monetary policy can be used to achieve this objective of low unemployment. Remember, monetary policy is not perfect. So you would be evaluating monetary policy, its short term versus long term effects, the pros and cons, how things in practice don't overmatch things in theory, and so on. This one here from the Global Economy Unit, using real world examples, discuss the possible implications of a persistent current account deficit. So you might want to define what the current account is, and then you would explain basically how a deficit can impact an economy positively, negatively in the short term, in the long term, how things are in theory versus in practice, and this is what you would evaluate. Okay, so these are all examples. You'll notice one common thing, or one thing they all have in common. They start with using real world examples, using real world examples, using real world examples, and they're all worth 15 marks. You should write any of those essays in 45 minutes. Now, where do you get your real world examples? Well, I have a video that I recorded previously about this. Pay attention to the real world examples that are mentioned in your textbook. Anywhere in the syllabus, the subject guide, where you see AO3, assessment objective 3, you should have a relevant real world example. Okay, so scroll through the syllabus and see what key terms or what theory points are AO3 assessment you need to be able to evaluate using real world examples. And then you just kind of collect articles in your journey. So make sure you are collecting articles. Okay. I have lots of real world examples, by the way, that I post for channel members as well as publicly available for channel subscribers. If you take a look at the video description below, you'll find the link to becoming a channel member. You'll find the link to saying thank you for this video by buying me a coffee. You'll find a link to other content where you can find real world examples, or you can just leave comments. I will reply to them. All right, so I chose the first essay here to kind of use as my sample for this method. So the question is, using real world examples, evaluate different approaches to managing common pool resources. Remember, common pool resources, this would be the key term that I would define, and the theory I would explain would come from market failure. So the first definition is where you define key terms. Common pool resources are resources that are not owned by anyone, but are available for anyone to use without payment. Examples include fisheries, forests, wildlife, hunting grounds, pastures, lakes, and the atmosphere. While many of these resources can replenish themselves, they tend to be overused, overexploited by humans. These resources are non-excludable but rivalrous, meaning it's very hard to exclude people from using the resources, but one person's consumption of the resources leaves less for everybody else. And then in the next paragraph, I started to explain relevant theory and explain the diagram that I've drawn while linking to a relevant real-world example. A relevant real-world example of a common pool resource is the fishery in Peru for catching anchovies for the purposes of extracting fish oil. This was an article that I came across in my readings. Okay, I know that the anchovetas fishery in Peru is facing a problem of overexploitation. And then I added a little bit more context. Peru's fish meal and fish oil industry have been accused of harmful and unsustainable practices, and the Peruvian anchovies are at a risk of being overfished. This leads to a situation where the marginal social cost MSC of producing fish oil is larger than the marginal private cost. These are labels that I am using in my diagram down here. Okay, and this is how I explain my diagram. I make sure that my explanation matches the diagram I drew. Reflecting negative externalities of production, the unsustainable overfishing and depletion of the fish stock in Peru. The market equilibrium QE, which is this point here, is shown in the diagram below, while the socially optimum quantity, Q opt, where MSB is equal to MSC and allocative efficiency is achieved. Since QE is greater than Q opt, this overproduction is creating a welfare loss as shaded in the diagram below. You'll notice here, after I defined key terms and explained relevant theory, I quickly introduced my real-world example while explaining the diagram. My labels used in the diagram explanation. My diagram is a regular negative externalities of production diagram, and the vertical distance is the unsustainable overfishing and the depletion of fish stock. Okay, and this is the welfare loss. You'll notice that my explanation of the diagram matches the diagram. So far, I haven't really answered the question. If you'll notice, this is all just providing context, theory, real-world example, and the diagram. The question is, evaluate different approaches to managing common pool resources. So this is where I start to evaluate. So this common pool resource can be managed in a variety of ways to ensure sustainability and to prevent overuse and depletion. Each approach has its pros and cons. So this is kind of like me kind of laying the foundation for my evaluation. The first approach is to impose an indirect tax. This will have the effect of raising on the fish meal and fish oil industry. This will have the effect of raising their costs of production and thus shifting the MPC curve to the left, closer to the MSC curve. You'll notice now I'm using the same labels in the diagram, so the examiner can kind of visualize what I'm trying to say. This will lead to a market equilibrium that is closer to the socially optimum quantity, Q opt, and thus reduce or eliminate the negative production externalities associated with the industry. However, here I'm starting to evaluate. You'll notice I explained the first approach, and then I'm going to counter argue. However, it's very difficult to measure the exact size of the negative externality, and thus it's difficult to correctly set the amount of the indirect tax needed to ensure more sustainable production practices. Also, indirect taxes are politically unpopular, and thus industry leaders can lobby against them and pressure politicians to vote against such measures. Moreover, if the indirect tax is too low, it may not bring about any change in behavior, while if it's too high, it may create a lot of unemployment and disruption in the industry. Here, I took one approach, which is the indirect tax. I explained how it works, and then I evaluated some of the problems or the cons or the weaknesses of this approach while mentioning certain stakeholders like politicians who might worry about imposing that tax, industry leaders who might lobby against that tax. The second approach, okay? Remember, the question is evaluate different approaches, okay? So different means at least two. You don't need to put 5 approaches like I did here. I may have over, okay? Yes, I'm a teacher. Yes, I typed this up, but I typed it up in about 45 minutes. While you're writing by hand, you won't have as much time. Maybe if you evaluate 2 or 3 approaches, that's enough. The second approach is to use legislation and regulation to set stricter production standards for the industry, which will also raise their cost of production and shift the MPC curve to the left. However, I'm evaluating the indirect tax, like indirect taxes, such laws and regulations can be fought against by industry leaders. The third approach is to use education and awareness to educate consumers about the harmful, unsustainable practices involved in the production of the fish oil pills that they are consuming. This should have the effect of decreasing demand for the product and thus shifting the MPB curve to the left. However, education and awareness campaigns are expensive and come with a high opportunity cost, as these funds could be used elsewhere, like improving infrastructure or funding public hospitals. If you write this much and then you add a conclusion paragraph, you are guaranteed a very high mark, depending on the examiner, but at least a 12 or a 13 or a 14, I promise you, okay? I added 2 more paragraphs just because I had the time and I might as well use it as an opportunity to review common pool resources. The fourth approach is to issue tradable permits for fishing firms in the industry. These permits will set quotas or limits for how much can be fished, and firms can sell their permits if they adopt more sustainable practices to other firms who may require more permits to allow for more fishing. A challenge with this approach, I'm evaluating again, is determining how many permits to issue and how to set limits for the quotas, and also how much to charge for each permit. Just like indirect taxes, if permits are priced too low, they may not incentivize the adoption of more sustainable fishing practices. While if these permits are priced too high, they may create a lot of disruption in the industry and create unemployment. The last approach is to encourage collective self governance by industry leaders. The Peruvian government can create conditions for the fish oil industry leaders to meet and engage in face to face bargaining and set their own rules and standards, and for them to have the autonomy to change and enforce these rules when needed. However, again, I'm evaluating, one can argue that if they wanted to engage in collective self governance, they already would have, and the common pool resource, which is the fishery, would not be under the threat of depletion. Okay? I evaluated 5 approaches to managing common pool resources. You do not need to evaluate that many. I may have overwritten because I'm also using this video to review common pool resources. Okay? But then this last paragraph is really important. All these approaches come with their own advantages and disadvantages, and it may be that a combination of these approaches is needed to ensure that the fishery, which is the common pool resource, is managed in a way that prevents unsustainable overuse and eventual depletion of the resource. After going through the essay, do you feel like I answered the question? Here's the question here. Using real world examples, evaluate different approaches to managing common pool resources. I started by defining common pool resources, explaining why common pool resources they face a threat of depletion or overexploitation. I quickly introduced my real world example, which is the fishery in Peru for catching anchovies. And I used the real world example to develop my explanation of the theory while explaining my diagram. And then I actually evaluated. I explained 5 different approaches. Each approach I explain how it works, and then I counter argue. However is your best friend when you are evaluating. You'll notice I use the word however a lot throughout my evaluation. Okay? You don't need to evaluate 5 approaches. Maybe 2 or 3 is sufficient to address the demands of the question. I evaluated 5 because I can write in 45 minutes. And then in the end, this conclusion paragraph where you make sure you have actually addressed the demands of the question. You link back to the question. And there you go. So in this video, I covered the assessment criteria for a paper 1 part B essay, a suggested structure where you define key terms, explain relevant theory, and introduce your real world example, draw and explain a diagram, evaluate using the chosen real world example, and then link back to the question to make sure that you've addressed it. And then I gave you an example of paper 1 part B questions from microeconomics, from macroeconomics, and from the global economy unit. And then I had a sample essay. If you liked this video, please press the like button, subscribe, share it with your friends, share it with your classmates. If you're a teacher watching this, share it with your students. Look at the video description below to find the various ways you can support the channel. You can buy me a coffee to say thanks, or you can become a channel member to access exclusive content. I hope you found this useful. I love making these videos for you all and sharing my knowledge and my experience. So please, again, help me with the algorithm. Press like, press share, press subscribe. Have a great rest of your Sunday afternoon and a great week at school ahead. Bye.